I also think he doesn't need any special introductions, being the not so well known, world-renowned person that he is. You know, one of the first things I ever read about polyamory was written by you.
What was it?
No, I do know about power and polyamory and non-monogamy. Do you remember the text?
Well, I mean, you described like
Exactly. See, I can't. Obviously, I can't remember the name right now.
probably the cheating in
Yeah.
that journal.
Yeah. Exactly. That was that. And then.
That many things. I haven't written that many things. I haven't. Whoa.
You can stand back and talk.
Hey. Okay.
So here with us from the United States, we have Peppermint, someone who's an activist, but who's also written in academic and scholarly venues, someone who really loves Foucault.
Oh, that is absolutely true.
And whom I love because he loves Foucault. And so without further ado, I give you Peppermint.
Hi, everyone. Now I'm actually a little freaked out by the microphone. How's my sound? It's good? Okay, so. How about now? No. Okay. So the title of this presentation is Power and Diversity in Organizing and Research. And that's because I really adore grandiose titles that really overstate what's going to happen. We are not covering the entire subject by any stretch of the imagination. That's a pretty big one, right? What I'm really here to talk about is representation, and specifically, I'm going to sort of go down some problems in representation that I see in both community organizing and also that I've been seeing in research, right? And so I'm going to start by talking about how power dynamics in non-monogamous community end up creating situations of exclusion and separate communities or people who can't be and can't find community at all. And then I'm going to move on to talking about how that affects research, sampling, representation in research, right? And then, because I like to be a solver rather than a hey, that's a problem kind of thing, I'm going to try to talk about some things that we can do about the problems that I'm seeing. But first, some things about me. The place I'm really, I wear a number of hats, but the place I'm really coming from for this presentation is that I'm a long-time event organizer and sort of community organizer in San Francisco. I've done this for the polyamory community, but also for sex party communities and for the BDSM community. I'm taking sort of an activist approach here, which should surprise no one. I am, yes, this is about activism. I'm not presenting research here or anything like that. And I want to start off by really sort of locating myself and talking about privilege, because I'm going to be talking about privilege a lot. You're going to get sick of hearing that word. I am a person with most of the privileges, talking to you here today. And by most of the privileges, I mean I am white, I am male, I am financially well off, I am a United States citizen, which is a privilege all its own. I have other privileges that I think we don't think of in the sort of like classic privilege sense, but like I actually have a very normative body type, right? And that's huge. That makes a huge difference in my life. I am allosexual as opposed to asexual. Did I get that term right? Okay, good. And so on and so forth, right? So I just want to locate myself as a person with most of the privileges. And say that I am a person with most of the privileges giving a presentation on diversity. And I want to just own that that's a precarious position that I am in here. I've put myself in a precarious position on purpose. And it's precarious in that, I in many ways don't have the background to really know the things, right, to say the things properly. I'm in danger of sort of reproducing privilege as I talk. And so if I do that, if I say things that are wrong or offensive or problematic, please let me know, either during comments or personally afterwards. I would like that. It also means that I'm going to be talking in a very basic way to sort of the privileged folks in the room, or more accurately, to the privileged side of people. I mean, privilege is a complex thing. There's sort of many different oppressions, and most of us have are on the, I like to say, winning side of certain oppressions, and the losing side of others. So I'm speaking to the winning side of folks today and saying, what can we, as people on the winning side, do? Okay, and that's where we're sort of located. Let's get into it. The main question of this presentation is who is not here, sort of the basic question of representation. And I'm going to start, I want to illustrate this question with a story, because I like stories. A number of years ago, a decade ago, I was new to the San Francisco polyamory community, and my partner, Jen, and I were trying to find community. Right, we were trying to find people we could talk with, but also dating partners. We were around the age of 30 at the time. There was a large number of events going on in the area. We went to all of them. We went to all of them repeatedly because we're very persistent people. But when we went to the events in the area, we discovered that they were all the same in a particular way, which is to say the age range was 40 to about 70. And this was a problem for us, because we couldn't find people in our life stage in some basic ways, but also, it was maybe a little less concern for me, but my partner wanted to date folks around age, blah, blah, blah. And we found this to be true sort of across the entire community. And I think there's sort of a historical thing that was happening in San Francisco there, because San Francisco had, the summer of '69 and the hippies and all that, and a lot of the people who were poly later were those people before, right? And so we got curious, because we were persistent people, and we were like, okay, why is this how is this maintained, right? Like, how does this keep happening? And so we started looking at the younger folks who did show up to these events. And what would happen is they would show up to an event and then not show up again to that event, or as far as we could tell, any other event. Or sometimes they'd hit like 2 or 3 and then pew. And we looked at the dynamics of what was happening. And in some cases, this was us or our friends who we were trying to bring into these things as well. And we were like, why? Why does this happen? The main problem seemed to be that when younger women showed up, they were hit on by older men. And it wasn't just that they were hit on by older men. These were actually very liberal, forward-thinking young women. But that they were hit on by older men in a way that was sort of generationally different, that made them uncomfortable. And so they did not come back. And so the people they came with did not come back as well. And in addition to that, I actually, like, it's cliched, but I actually saw a number of instances of like older folks simply talking over younger people. And it happened, a lot of the things going on at the time were discussion groups, and there were these cases where I was like, that's a very cool little young anarchist triad, and I want to hear what they had to say, and I did not hear what they had to say. It just didn't happen, right? So anyways, so that's what was going on. And being solution-oriented folks, we were like, okay, we can solve this. And we started a group with an explicit age limit. We were like, if you're under this age, come to our group. And it worked, actually. People came out of the woodwork. All these folks, I guess in some cases, folks who had come to the events and gone away, but in other cases, entirely new folks showed up to our events. And the events were sort of an instant success, and success in like poly organizing terms at that time meant like we got 30 people. Woo! People didn't stay around too much. Mostly they showed up, socialized, met some folks, and then moved on, right? So it was this there was suddenly this community building space, a sort of landing pad. It was great, it's functional. It actually still exists today, though I'm not running it because I'm over the age limit. I've done a number of radical organizing things in my organizing career, and this is the one that got me so much hate mail, right? It was incredible, actually. And it wasn't just that it was like, sometimes it was people making sort of logical arguments, like you're ageist, and so forth. But actually other times it was just like straight up venom. And I want to take some lessons from this rather than just tell you a story, because I like to talk. I want to take some lessons about from this. And number one is that the power dynamics of exclusion are subtle and complex and often involve sort of multiple lines of oppression, right? This wasn't just about age, though that's how it was manifesting. And age itself is complex. It's not like older people have all the power and younger people don't, but it was sort of showing up that way in the situation. But it was also about gender. It was about the way age was interacting with gender, right? It was a complex situation. I think that's standard for what's going on. In addition, there's sort of this effect where we have these exclusions, and the exclusions are often invisible or unspoken of, right? But they really actually limit the reach of community. This community was, say, about half, maybe 2/3 the size it could have been at the time, and no one had really sort of noticed. But there was this homogeneity going on that was not seen, right? And also, when you have a situation like that, where there's a group that sort of ends up privileged in a homogeneous kind of way, and then you challenge that, often there will be sort of vicious reprisals. Even from people who sort of claimed they were unaware of the problem when you went to them earlier, which is what happened to us. And in fact, let me say something about that. When we talked to older people when we were in this process, a lot of them said, and this was a thing you could actually say in 2004 and be taken seriously, a lot of them said, actually, there just aren't younger poly people in the area. Right? Everyone's laughing. But it was believable, given the situation in the groups, right? Because, they went to all the groups too, and they saw the same thing I was seeing. And they were like, you're so young and radical, look at you go. But they were wrong about that. They were straight up wrong about that. And I guess what I want to say is that I'm going to make a claim here, which is not backed, but I'm going to say that non-monogamy is a fairly base urge, or rather a fairly common urge, right? It's not something that everyone has, the urge to non-monogamy, but if you slice and dice the population in any particular way, when we're talking, say, adults, you're going to find folks in whatever your grouping is that want to be non-monogamous. And that might not necessarily be polyamory or something like that, but some kind of not monogamy, right? And to illustrate that, I'm going to tell a little story. A couple years ago, so this is well into my organizing career, right? This is 2012. I somewhat haphazardly, well, maybe it wasn't haphazard, I was invited into an event. The event was a poly people of color panel in Oakland. It was for poly people of color, or people of color who were non-monogamous. I was invited in as a white ally because I was organizing a conference at the time. And I was very surprised when I got there. I was surprised by how many people there were who were there who I did not know. And to sort of clarify, I was the big poly organizer in San Francisco at the time, right? I knew all the people, except not for these 110 people that were at this event, which is, I just said a 30-person event. That was big, right? This was a 110-person event. It was massive. And there was very clearly a need there, and actually a community and a series of social groupings, right? And perhaps actually formalized events that had been going on, and I had no idea about them because I'm white in the area, and I have that privilege. And in some ways, I was perhaps doing the thing that the older people were doing when I was entering the community, right? I was being in community and being well, I don't know. Poly people of color, are they around here? Maybe, right? And if you had asked me a little earlier, I might have had that response and I would have been wrong. And in fact, there was this entire, and the way I think about it is this entire parallel community that had existed for a while, actually, when I sort of dug into it. Without me even knowing. And so I sort of want to, for the rest of this presentation, retain this concept of multiple parallel communities in an area. And sometimes the parallel communities are not well formed, right? They might just be social groups, or they might be, in some ways, people on their own. But I think it's easy for a certain region to develop a pattern where you have, let's just talk about polyamory, where you have a sort of very public, very visible polyamorous community where the people in it have most of the privileges. And then sort of a series of parallel communities that are much more characterized by privacy, that tend to be safe spaces for the folks in them, folks who perhaps are going to show up to the privileged groups and face oppression, right? And since that happened, I've been sort of keeping my eye out, and I'm like, oh, right, that's happening with queer poly people in San Francisco too. Oh, right, I sort of see that a bit with like disability communities and polyamory as well in the area. So I think this was happening on multiple axes the entire time, and I was not seeing it. And there's sort of a general problem with non-monogamous communities, of course, which is that they are highly stigmatized and so tend to be private in the first place. And there's a lot of sort of, I call it siloing, right, where social groups, even in those perhaps visible, highly privileged communities, often don't know about each other. So there's this sort of very scattershot effect in areas. And I think that's then amplified when you have sort of axes of oppression at work, right, and you end up with separate communities. And I want to talk about that process a bit. So I'm talking about exclusion, the exclusion that creates these things. I think there are the things that we're used to talking about, right? Subtle expressions of privilege, microaggressions, actually interactions in relationships, and this is highly relevant for polyamory, right? Like if say poly person of color is dating a poly white person and they are having bad power dynamic interactions, they might not continue dating, or the poly person of color might not find them suitable as a dating partner in the first place, and so on and so forth, right? So it tends to create separate communities. And then when sort of these power dynamics sort of blow up and bigger things happen, things that are aggressions of the not so micro variety perhaps, I've seen it happen multiple times that the communities, or at least the visible public privileged communities, line up on the side of privilege, right? I think we all know that pattern. And in addition, there's a sort of secondary effect when we're talking about like volunteer community organizing, which is that, well, who are the volunteers who have a lot of time and energy and resources? Like I've put, thousands of dollars into organizing, right? Those are the people with most of the privileges. And they tend to create, so they tend to rise to the top, number one, in leadership positions, being in the media, stuff like that, doing the actual organizing. We tend to rise to the top. I have absolutely done this. And there's this tendency for groups to reflect their leaders. So you end up very easily creating the situation where groups form, and the way they form is actually sort of around privileges, right? And I've certainly seen this process in action, and actually I've been part of this process as one of those leaders, right? And then of course for people in the privileged, perhaps public group to fail to notice the absence, to notice who is not here when this happens. And the upshot is that you can have a region with perhaps a very visible poly community, a very seemingly vibrant poly community, but the resources of that community are not available to large segments of the population in that area, right? And that's, ends up not just being about sort of the resources that we think of, like, oh, I can go to this group and meet some people, or I can find dating partners, but actually also resources that are perhaps a little more ideological in nature, right? If you have then these leaders, these community leaders doing things like, say, writing books and creating like online resources, which, I have created online resources, in fact, so I've probably been culpable of this. Those resources will reflect the ideologies that have at their base privilege, right? The ideologies are coming from a privileged place, and in some very real ways, they will not be relevant to people without those privileges. And I think that's a general problem I can say with our sort of like poly resource set out there in the world. And there's a sort of further, I guess let me say it this way. It's not just not good for the people who don't get to be in the communities or who don't have access, but it's actually not good for the movement as a whole. And I'm a movement activist, so I really want to emphasize that. When you end up creating non-monogamous communities and non-monogamous movements that are in some ways an expression of privilege, right, then in a very real way, we have not done a new thing. people who have most of the privileges have been able to be non-monogamous for a very long time, right? And that's, and then that non-monogamy has taken many forms, sex work, mistresses, so on and so forth, right? But that is not a new thing. We have not done a radical world-changing thing. Much as poly people love to talk about how we're doing a radical world-changing thing, if we're only creating communities for folks who have most of the privileges, we have not done that thing. And I want to, I'm going to pick on a community. I'm going to pick on nudism. And I feel I can do this because my parents were nudists, and I went to nudist camps as a kid and that sort of thing. And I feel like in nudism we have an example, and I'm getting really US-centric here, let me be clear. Nudism in the US was very vibrant in the 60s and 70s and had a lot of ideological mindshare. And then the 80s happened. But also, kind of just didn't go places. There wasn't a radical agenda. There were not connections built across lines of oppression. If you think about it, right? The urge to be naked is pretty basic. Can we agree on that? Have you met some 3-year-olds recently who just rip off all their clothes and run around the house, right? But the movement itself focused, and hopefully I'm not mischaracterizing it here, but I feel like it focused on let's get our beaches, let's get our resorts, right? Let's get our gathering places, then let's be in those gathering places and be happy. And many of those places still exist today, but the resorts are $120 a day, right? Or what? I might be wrong about that, but the resorts are expensive, absolutely. The beaches are free, but there's less and less beaches, and that's because the movement was not vibrant and did not create an agenda or a sort of political sense. And so when the beaches close, there's no one there to really kind of defend them. There's sort of people here and people there. San Francisco, in the past couple months, passed an anti-nudity ordinance. I know, right? That is ridiculous. What are we thinking? But and there was not much in the way of organized defense because there was not a movement. There was not a movement around this principle. There was at one time, and in some ways that opportunity was squandered, I'm going to say, which is a pretty harsh way to put it. But from a political perspective, I think that's absolutely true. And so I just want to say, overall, right, I'm very attached to polyamory. I don't want to see it go that way, and I don't think it necessarily will, but I think it certainly could regionally, absolutely. But I think actually, no, I'm going to say that. I think the movement as a whole could sort of move itself into irrelevance by being a movement for the privileged. And certainly a lot of the critiques I see, I see a lot of critiques, let me say. People who are saying, well, I don't identify as poly because, and then after the because is something about privilege or oppression, right? Okay, so I've been talking about communities. I'm going to take a little drink break. Let's talk about research. The main thing I want to say about research is sort of related to these separated communities, right? These parallel communities. There's a representation problem in non-monogamous research. I'm going to actually make that a very general statement. Look at that. There is just a representation problem in non-monogamous research. And I think it's coming from a number of places. And I've absolutely seen it here at this conference today, not today. It's very early today. I've seen it at this conference multiple times over the last couple days in various contexts, in small studies, in big studies, actually. I think one of the places this representation problem comes from is the problem I've described of the communities, right? If you are a researcher, it is very easy to access sort of the public privileged poly community, or I've seen this actually happen in other communities as well. I've absolutely seen this happen in BDSM. It's very easy to access that community to then convenient sample and find a bunch of connections from that community to similar sub-communities, honestly, and to not locate these sort of parallel communities or people who aren't in community at all, perhaps because of exclusion factors that are happening, right? And I'm not a researcher, and I'm ripping on research here, so I just want to say I understand there's a lack of funding, and a lot of this can be very difficult, but at the same time, we definitely, I think, have this outcome, and I want to call it out. In addition, of course, there are power dynamics during the research process itself, like what are the research goals, what are the research questions, how are those perhaps expressing privilege. The researchers themselves are often like me. They have most of the privileges, right? Yeah. And so we can end up with the power dynamics in the research process itself, which then creates exclusion because someone's got to take your survey or show up to your interview or whatever. And the outcome is that research, we have research that in a sort of basic way does not see, right? And it's partly that it doesn't see people, like I just sort of described that as the representation problem, but it's much worse than that, actually, because it's not seeing groups of people, sets of people who are similar and who are different from the people it is seeing. And what that means is that you're sort of, and I've seen this happen, you can make conclusions about the entire community, and those conclusions are wrong, right? And we don't like our wrong research. And specifically, I want to say something about power and tactics there, right? When people are multiply marginalized, they have different tactics. Often, I'm going to say more adaptive, or like it's hard to express this in terms of power, but like stronger tactics because it's a worse position to be in. And when we have research that tends to address the sort of more public, visible, mostly privileged folks, it misses out on these other tactics. It misses out on very real opportunities to figure out what's going on in sort of what I want to think of as the more incredible layer of what's happening. Does that make sense? Yeah. And in the end, if we have research that is giving voice to certain folks and not voice to others, well, let's talk about who those folks are, right? Like, if we have research that is giving voice to the already privileged, people who have always had a voice, right? And research that is not giving voice to the underprivileged, that research itself is not radical. It's just, it is reinforcing the things that already exist rather than undermining them or changing them. And that's, I know I'm saying some harsh things here. And I'm also, I want to say, generalizing heavily, right? I've absolutely seen counterexamples at this conference, and this conference has done some amazing things, for example, around asexuality, and I want to acknowledge that. But I think we can do more. I think we need to do more. And in fact, let's talk about the more things we can do. And let's talk about the we that is doing the more things. I said at the beginning, I'm speaking from a privileged viewpoint, and I want to say again, for the rest of this talk, the we I'm going to refer to repeatedly is again from that privileged side of things. And I apologize. I know I am to some extent erasing, but this is what I have to offer, actually. Like, I can speak to what we as privileged folks should do about the problem. I do not have the credentials to speak about what folks who don't have particular privileges can do about the problem, so I'm not going to. Yeah. And so I have a number of calls for action. And I want to say, some of this is going to read like, oh, Allyship 101 or something like that, or Activism 101, but I think it needs to be said, and I want to say it in this particular context and connect it to the things I've been talking about. And I also want to say that none of these are mine. I have stolen all of these from, anti-oppression activists of various flavors, right? And the first thing I want to say is this question. This question of who is not here is super important. And I feel like I'm going to talk about my own personal journey. And a large number of years ago, I started really asking myself, in most situations I was in, who is not here? And that's a hard question because you are seeing absence, right? So, you have to start by being like, well, who is here? And we can talk about this at this conference, right? Certain groups have shown up in force, and that's been great. Folks who typically don't get a voice. And other groups absolutely have not. Or, it somehow just didn't work out. I'm going to give some examples. From my organizing background, I know that there's a thing going on with trans folks and non-monogamy, and but I don't know what it is because I'm cisgendered, right? And we haven't really, I think, unless I've been missing things on the schedule, I feel like we haven't talked too much about that at this conference. There are things going on with disability and non-monogamy. and I don't know what those are because I am mostly able-bodied, at least for now. And again, those things have not shown up. So I think there's this sort of, and I guess I'm describing a process. There's a process of looking at a thing that is happening and saying, what is not happening, or who is not here, and then sort of working from that back towards like, how can we change this? What can we do? And I guess there's a basic question that sort of follows on, which is, as someone who is doing things, like in my case, as a community organizer, I have this question, which is, who am I serving? And perhaps a little bit more, who am I not serving? Right? When I am doing my thing, am I only serving certain sets of people? And and to just be really frank, like this is something I totally struggle with. To this day, I run a play party that's very clearly only serving fairly privileged folks. And I keep trying to change that, and it is hard. It is a struggle. And it's not just that I'm trying to change that thing, but like maybe I just shouldn't do that thing. Maybe I should do some other thing, right? And so I want to really, a call I want to give out to you is to ask yourselves, who is not here? And also, who am I serving and who am I not serving? I think that's a very important question. And I'm going to say in the context of research, we really got to get away from the college student method of sampling. I'm just going to put that out there to sort of put it crossly. And more generally, like I know we have to deal with convenience samples. I know there are no, or the sampling is super hard for the reasons I've described. But I really want to encourage folks to make your samples a bit more inconvenient, as it were, to get into some inconvenience, to do some hunts for people who are not represented. I think there's a sort of I'm saying things about things I don't know, so correct me if I'm wrong. But, I see this thing where people are like, okay, well, I'm going to start this, and I'm going to go to these people who are very easy to get to, and that's how I'm going to start, and then later I'll bring in these other people, and later I think is already a little too late. So, if you could start off at least doing the investigation of what else is going on, I think that's super crucial. And I want to make a disclaimer here, which is that, I'm talking about inclusion here, and inclusion is a little bit of a fraught topic. Like the goal is not, I'm like, who is not here, right? The goal is not just to get those people here. The goal is not to get those people to the thing we are already doing, right? Inclusion of that sort is a very weak goal. It lets us think that we have done a thing when perhaps we have just brought people into a power dynamic they don't want to be in, right? So I think it's more important to understand, why are those folks not here? Are they in fact better off not being here, and that's why it's happening, and what's going on there, right? So it's much more complex, and it's much more about power and how we change power than how we just get people in rooms. And to follow on with that, I'm going to make my second call here, which is that, what I have found in my own personal experience is that there's a crucial step that I think a lot of people miss. And that crucial step is building personal connections across lines of power. If we, the privileged, are doing this. If folks who are not privileged are doing it, then building personal connections sort of on the same side of lines of power. In the times when I have managed to build those connections, amazing things have happened. When I have not built those connections, I ended up serving the privileged, right? And so I want to say this is like one of the single most important things you can do. And I'm going to talk a bit more about how we do this. And it's hard to do, right? It's very easy to be tokenizing or to reproduce those power dynamics and so on and so forth. And it's something I watch out for and I struggle with. And if you do this, you will struggle with as well. But it needs to be done, and it needs to be done by making ourselves uncomfortable and putting ourselves in sort of hard situations and trying to actually talk to people about really hard shit. And one of the sort of modalities that this occurs in is, I think it's really important to collaborate with or put people in charge who are multiply marginalized. And I say that like it's easy, but it is again the problem of building connections, and it's actually quite difficult. It often requires changing ourselves to a point where we can do that. And I expect that many of the people in the room have already done this sort of thing, but if you have not done sort of a lot of research on allyship on various axes of oppression, because it's different for each one, right? I encourage you to do that. When I have done that, which is, never enough, when I have done that, I've been successful, right? But let me talk about putting people in charge. The way, it's not just enough to be like, oh, let's go find some people and talk with them. Okay, we're talking with them, yay, right? But like power is actually involved here. So I want to encourage people to find ways, people who have most of the privileges like myself, to find ways to put multiply marginalized people in power above you, to reverse that power dynamic. Yeah, and that's hard. That is giving up privilege. And I want to speak to that right here myself at this conference. When the conference organizers came to me and said, hey, do you want a keynote? I was like, yes, I totally want a keynote. But the email I sent back was, yes, but I have a commitment to anti-racism. And if I'm going to keynote at your conference, I want to hear from you about how you are going to sort of include people of color and topics around that. And they gave me a pretty good answer, and I'm here today. But, yes, let's just sort of stick with that. And I want to encourage all of you to do that, right? There are these moments when we have made it, like when we're asked to keynote for a conference, that's making it right there. And in those moments, it's a great time to step back and reflect and be like, how can I use this power that I have to help folks who have not made it, who do not have certain privileges that I have, whatever those might be. And also I want to say as part of that, I'm not sure I should be up here talking about diversity today. I want to really encourage organizers, conference organizers, researchers, whatever, to put people on stage who have multiple marginalizations, who are not like me. Even if that means I am not on this stage, okay? And I would like to really, I'm gonna call out the next conference and be like, folks, let's do that, right? And I'm gonna sort of switch topics a bit here. And say, I wanna say there's a reason there. It's not just about, having folks in charge, but also having voices. But there's a thing about the knowledge behind the voices, right? There's this sort of basic rule of a system of oppression where the people who are on the winning end it is advantageous for the people on the winning end of a system of oppression to not know very much about the system of oppression. It is advantageous for the people on the losing end of a system of oppression to know as much as possible about the system of oppression. It's often a matter of survival, right? And so the knowledge about the oppression is located sort of on the less powerful end. And that's why it's important to collaborate and put people in charge. Because let me tell you, and I know this from personal sort of direct experience, you hit all these little things. When I am organizing, I hit all these little things where I'm excluding people by accident. But if I'm working with folks who can see those exclusions, they can help me not do that because they know more than me. And so there's a crucial piece there, which is I have to listen to them. And this is a piece which I see missed again and again and again, which is why I'm bringing it up, right? So please, there will come those times when someone who is marginalized speaks out and says, hey, you are doing this thing. And to you, it might not seem like a thing. Right, huh? Yeah. I've been there. It might not seem that important, or the logic might actually not make sense, or what have you. And I want to encourage you in those moments to believe those people, because when I have not believed those people, I've been wrong every time. Right? Please don't be me. And I want to specifically call out something here when it comes to listening to people for researchers again. And this varies a lot, but I sometimes see researchers who are doing research on a particular thing. They are studying polyamory in San Francisco or whatever, and they do not contact the community organizers, like me. I'm really promoting myself here. They do not contact the community organizers, much less do they contact the community organizers who are marginalized in multiple ways, or activists, or whoever, the educators, the folks who know the things. Right? Like people will go and they'll research like sexual acts, and they will not like contact the people who are holding workshops on those sexual acts, right? Who have talked to a lot of people about said sexual acts. And when that happens, it's very easy to produce research that has sort of wonky goals, right, or assumptions, and ends up being irrelevant. And I don't want research to be irrelevant. I want it to be highly relevant. Worse, sometimes the research produced is damaging to the communities involved. And I'm going to call out a specific example around that. Who here knows J. Michael Bailey? Right, yeah, huh? Here we go. J. Michael Bailey is a researcher in the US who has done incredible damage to bi men's community and trans women's community, to bi men and to trans women, actually. He did the survey or the study in like 2004-ish, I want to say. I don't know, I got the year wrong, I'm sure. That was basically like the conclusion was bi men don't exist. Right, you know this, yeah. And I was, in bisexual community at the time, and if he had just come and talked to me, I could have been like, well, here are these 10 guys, right? Let them tell you about their sex lives. Okay, now, are you really sure you want to say this in the New York Times? And, presumably he didn't do that because he didn't care, or was advancing an agenda of certain sorts. I don't like the guy. But, I think it's very easy to do that by accident, actually, and I want to call out that danger. And say, when there's a thing going on, talk to people who are not academic, who are activists, educators, leaders, whatever, especially if they have multiple marginalizations going on. And know that their viewpoints will be limited, but it's often, like I have worked with thousands upon thousands of poly people, right? If you have a thing you are studying about poly and you ask me about it, I can be like, here, this, here's a good place to get started, and that's a great topic, or whatever, right? So, use that, absolutely. And I know I've been very negative today. So I'm going to, that's my last call right there. I'm going to wrap up with a sort of more positive story and talk about that a little bit. In 2012, which is apparently a very big year for me, I held a conference, which I didn't hold the conference. I was the lead organizer on a conference, OpenSF. It only happened once, unfortunately, but maybe we'll get back to it someday. And somewhat haphazardly, the staff of the conference that I assembled was quite diverse. And I say somewhat haphazardly because it wasn't me that did it. It was actually this woman that did it, so really she deserves the credit. But the random part was that I brought her in. And then she was like, okay, let's do this. Let's make this diverse. Here we go. So I really owe it to her. And by diverse, I mean it was about half people of color. One of the people on staff was trans. There were, I would say, 2 disability advocates on there. And just folks that had sort of general more consciousness about the sort of stuff that happens around impression and inclusion at events. And this meant we could do some really amazing things. Number one, it was very easy to get a very highly diverse set of presenters. Because I actually did not have those connections, because other people on staff had connections into a number of different interesting communities that were not sort of already well represented. And that happened, and the presenter list was astounding. And it's still online. I encourage you to go look it up at opensf.org, right? And there was another thing that happened, which is there were a number of times, and I think like 8, 10, there were a number of times in the conference organizing process when I would do a thing. I would put a page on the website or whatever, and people would come to me and they would say, Pepper. They were, maybe not so gently. They would say, Pepper, you are fucking up. You are doing a thing here that makes our conference look bad and is going to make it not inclusive. And I'd be like, really? This doesn't seem like all that big of a thing. And I was wrong. It was. And there's an important lesson there. Little things are not little things. Right? If nothing else, dealing with the little things shows that when the big things do come up, you will deal with the big things. So it's really important to deal with the little things, right? And that meant that we sort of got, some of the screw-ups were irreversible, like that media thing. But a number of the screw-ups were reversible, and so we ended up at the end of the day with a conference that was inclusive, that felt like home to a number of different communities. And we got really great feedback on the conference, and it was huge. It was 500 people. And it was just sort of a really excellent experience, and probably the pinnacle of my organizing career so far. And the lesson there's a particular lesson I want to bring from that, and that is that my part in that process was actually not all that hard. Absolutely, there were a number of challenges at various points and arguments and so on and so forth. But I am, again, the person in the room with most of the privileges. And so for me, it was not that hard. It was certainly easier for me than some of the other folks who were involved. And I want to hold that point. It's not, I have been sitting up here talking about these things that seem very challenging, that seem very hard, and they are not that hard. It became not that hard to me, or fairly, I don't want to say easy because that's not true either, but not too difficult. It became not too difficult to me when I really made a commitment, when I made a personal commitment to make the event inclusive in a number of these ways and to really go to the mat and do it. And at various points we had arguments, we lost staff members, there were fights, the works. But because I had that commitment, it was relatively easy for me. And I want to say to you, these hard things I have been describing, if you are on the privileged side of things, are not as hard as they sound. They are not as hard as they sound if you make a commitment, a personal commitment, to sort of following through on doing the things. And it's, once you do that, actually, in some ways, there's a certain sense of freedom and accomplishment and ease. And so I want to really encourage all of you to find ways to do that in your own lives. And that's what I got to say today. Thank you very much. Okay, I'm moving. Questions will, I think, be after Maria.
Yep.
Yes.
Thank you. I'll just keep referring to you. This is fantastic. I'm Pepper now.
Go forward here.
Thank you. Hey, Daniel.
Yeah.
Is it possible to put
Yeah.
this just a little bit?
I think that's this one.
Yeah. Is that clearer for everyone? Yeah. Great. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Just let me know when I can start. I'll be looking at you. Great, thank you, and welcome everyone. And Pepper, thank you. I'm going to keep going, as Pepper said, as Pepper said, as Pepper said. Those issues resonate with me very much, personally and professionally, where I'm situated. And I just want to recommend one book which is published by an Australian professor with whom I did The Politics of Recognition and Social Justice, Bob Pease, P-E-A-S-E. His book is called Undoing Privilege, and one of the issues he looks at is heteronormativity. So it's an incredible book, and I just want to thank you, Pepper. And I want to thank Daniel. We met 2 years ago at the LGBT Psychology Conference here in Lisbon, and here we are again, and this has been absolutely fantastic. Meg John, 10 years ago. Bloomsbury Park, outside the British Museum. It's like, hello. And isn't it terrible when, you don't see each other in Australia? Linda, Jessica, Nico, you have to come all the way to Lisbon to actually, say hello to each other. It's really, really bad. And there's a lot of shameful things happening in our country on all those levels that Pepper and Brigida yesterday talked about. So I'm going to talk about the films. And don't you love it when you spend so much time preparing your presentation and you get the title wrong? Like, really? Polly and Moore's Go the Movies. Like, there's a preposition in there, My undergrads would be having a great time now going, see, proofread. So, yeah, I'm so sorry about that. I just looked at it now. And it's terrible. So what I'm going to do is, let's go for a romp through film. And so many of the issues that Brigida, Pepper, Nathan, so many people are talking about this conference are going to be so evident in the films that we're going to be looking at. Who's got the privilege, who is missed out, who constructs which text for who, some very, very important issues. This is a very scary presentation to be giving because film, as you know, when you're a filmmaker, is so subjective. You know, we go to films personally. We want to situate ourselves or others within a text. And so it's a bit of a challenge for me because I'm looking at film from the perspectives of my research participants and seeing how they constructed often very mainstream funny films and saw within those films very problematic and very difficult issues. Very important. Also, how can you talk about film, and I haven't worked this out yet, without spoilers? So I'm so sorry, I'm spoiler alert. You know, you can I'm going to be giving you some endings because sometimes the endings are really problematic for bisexual and poly people to film. So I'll tell you that now. And some of these films are quite traditional, normative films, but really they say much about what you said, the little things that go miss. So basically we're going to be looking at pathology, punishment and possibility, and the way that films internationally and across time, as much as I can, these are only snippets of films that my research participants, bisexual young people, polyamorous people, people of diverse cultural backgrounds have pointed out to me. I still get lovely emails from research participants go, have you seen? Go and watch. And it's fantastic. So there's ongoing relationships and the importance of text. And so I just want to say that's part of the work. I did want to put Meg Jong's book up there as well, Understanding Monogamy. So what I'm talking about today are little sections of larger projects that we've done. And I also really take your comment about trans and non-monogamy. One of my PhD students who's renowned in Australia is a trans activist, academic and author, Julie Peters. Please look her up. Her whole research, her PhD, which we finished in 2 months, yay, is about an autoethnography looking at her gender queerness and film and cultural texts. And so, for example, she talks about the classic Alfred Hitchcock Psycho and coming across that film when, as a young genderqueer person, she's wearing her mother's dresses and going out at midnight, walking the streets to see how it feels so beautifully to be a woman, goes to see Psycho, and of course it's the character wearing the mother's clothes who's killing the normative female. You know, like this classic was very traumatic for people like my student Julie. So I think, let's look at film, as you said, from very multiple perspectives and what we might miss. Okay, so you're going to see lots of things of lots of different films coming up as I go through. Let's see how we go. So again, as I said yesterday, I'm working with Judith Butler's theories about the limits of the sayable and the perpetuation of dichotomous logics. And in so many texts, we've got such heteronormative scripts. You know, the straight characters, the straight plots. Oh, maybe the characters that go a little bit less straight for a while, and then they come back. You know, oh, phew, I found myself again, I'm okay. You know, the straight monogamous couples with, of course, the ongoing, you know, adultery, cheating, jealousy, murders, etc., etc. On the other hand, what we're finding is an increasing text, film, Modern Families, Glee, although I really love the Santana character in Glee, who does not leave her Britney S. Spears for a man. She actually stays with her. I thought, yeah, this is really good. And this is what my students are pointing out to me. Have you seen Glee? Yep. and I love it. Young people reminding me. Homonormativity. So we've got more and more gay and lesbian characters in film, but with them predominantly gay and lesbian monogamous couples, and they're going through adultery, cheating, jealousy. All right. Cabaret. Some of you would know. Pivotal text. This was pointed out to me by some of the students, bisexual students in Jewish schools in Australia, in my research in border families. And they found it really hilarious, and of course played up in class, because their teachers were teaching cabaret as part of their studies into Nazism in Germany. Never once talking about the sexualities, the polyamories. And these students are going, and if they dared to ask, they actually went to see the play, so they'd go off for school excursions to see cabaret when it was in Australia as a stage production. But it was like, okay, we'll talk about Nazism, we'll talk about this, the Holocaust, and rightly so, but we won't talk about. And these are these students sitting there who are identifying as bi, trans, poly, going, well, hang on, there's some major, major stuff in this film that's not being addressed in an official curriculum. But they, of course, all talked about it and played up in class and tried to write about it. I woke up at 6:30 in the morning this morning and went, paint your wagon, which is really obsessive. And some of the older women in my research would refer to this film. Interestingly, it came out in 1969, at that time of shifts in the United States. Good old Clint Eastwood, Lee Marvin, Gene Seberg. The story is it's the California gold rush, and these, California, there's not enough women, so this Mormon guy decides to sell off one of his wives to Lee Marvin's character. But then, of course, Clint Eastwood and her fall madly in love, but for a while, she's their kind of domestic cleaner, housekeeper in the middle of this gold rush, etc. And then, of course, great ending. Lee Marvin decides, I'm going to go off and find other things, and a nice, happy, mono couple, again, as a resolution. And for the number of older women in my research, this film was really significant. They're like, we're watching this, we're going to the stage, it's a musical. And, sometimes this was the only text that some of the older women that I worked with could actually connect to in sometimes problematic ways. Okay, so I guess just a little bit of theory. I love B.J. Epstein's work, The Case of the Missing Bisexuals. And I really owe much to B.J. Epstein, Beth Roberts, Mike Szymanski, so many people who do film reviews for the Journal of Bisexuality, which is fantastic, and also Sheila Lambert, who is the leader of the Bi Writers in New York, who actually wrote lots of material around film and literature for the collection we did, which is Bisexuality and Education. Don't worry about buying it. It's actually Journal of Bisexuality, 2014, Volume 1, Number 1. So just go in and you can see all these amazing texts that they talk about. So 2 theories that are really important when we do this work is cultivation theory. The importance of people wanting to see themselves represented or others, so that they can actually get a sense of reality and possibility and perception is really important. The other one is social cognitive theory by Bandura, where he talks about if you actually have people who are positive and popular and attractive in a multi-dimensional way, you actually are able to think, yeah, I can do that, I can be that. And so these 2 theories were very significant in how we analyse text, especially film. And I really love B.J. Epstein's words, films are mirrors or windows. Films should be opportunities to reflect and critically examine oneself, and to reflect and critically examine outside, a window to other peoples, especially around diverse marginalities. And as I said, they're the theories we use. Okay, and I spoke last night about really all my research could have just been done in one statement. The world isn't heterosexual or homosexual, it's lots of sexuals. And this was a beautiful young woman when I was interviewing a poly family in the United States, and I just want to put that up there because sometimes I look at what we do and think, really, it's so obvious. And here we go, waxing on. So, and yet if it is a world of lots of sexuals and lots of relationships, what's really sad is the fact that often bisexual and poly people in film are punished through problematising their dysfunctional in relationships. They're the problem add-on. They come in and disrupt a straight relationship and cause kerfuffle. It's this, they're problematising. But I want to show you another side to that later. They're pathologised. They're the ones who have got the mental health issues. They're killing people. There's this, the ice pick in Basic Instinct, and this kind of there's got to be a mental health issue, as I said in Psycho, for example. Criminalised. When you see this, you'll be surprised how many bi characters or poly characters are actually thieves, stealing. And I'm just wondering if that's a symbolic thing. They're stealing. It's really fascinating, and I'll show you some examples of that. They're murderers, they're carrying on illegal activities. Again, is that symbolic about illegality? I'm not sure. Again, there's lots of questions that come up. They're dehumanised. Now, look, I'm a sci-fi freak. I'm waiting to see Star Wars come out at the end of this year in Australia. But, so many times, poly and bi are represented as something that's in another world, not here. It's in another galaxy, another planet, in the future. Or they're the horror, the zombies, the vampires, the female vampires. And it's interesting, this use of fear, but again, the positives to that. What's it saying about the fragility of normativity that these characters are quickly able to dismantle? It's really fascinating. And trivialise. Look, I love humour. As I said to Brigitte, I've got the worst of Southern Italian and Australian humour, so forgive me. And yet humour can be used to trivialise people's lives. It can be used to exoticize, and people become objects of entertainment. Whereas humour could also be used to educate, reflect, etc. And as you did with your film, Lutine, this use of humour to problematise. Okay, and in most films, bisexual and poly people end up dead or murdered. I'm sorry. Here we are, alive, doing well. If you go through this, I'm sorry there's so much there, and I'm happy to give this presentation to anyone who wants a copy. Go through the films, and these are films from France, Spain, UK, US, etc. Murdered by boyfriend, strangled in the men's room, blown up by the wife, dies in a motorbike accident. Just when they're working out their relationship, there's got to be a death. The Brazilian film Romance, the bisexual politician is killed. Now, I'm not saying these realities don't happen, but what happens when these are the only representations that we have? And as in Death Trap, the character dies a violent death. His lover kills him after he's killed the wife for the lover. Can you imagine me sitting through all these films? Burglar, the bisexual is killed by his own lover, who happens to be a lawyer but is wanting money. So in Greg Araki, look, I love Greg Araki's films. However, let's problematise the fact that the deaths of the young bisexual and poly people is a constant theme in Araki's films. In Living End, the young bisexual man is stabbed to death after picking up other guys for sex. We're getting some pretty interesting moral, lessons here. And in the Spanish film El Diputado, the fascist party destroys the career of a congressman. They set him up with a young male lover who they then kill and make sure that he's with the body. This is after the Spanish congressman, apparently it was based on a true story, had set up a beautiful threesome with this young man with her partner. But someone's got to die. I find this theme very problematic throughout film, traditionally. Okay, female bisexuality, what can we say? The hot bi girl in action for and it's constantly represented in ways that are for a heterosexual male audience, and usually produced by heterosexual older men who have power and privilege in the film industry, who are constructing certain images of female bisexuality. I really love Wayne Bryant's work, and Farr's, tossed into the script for erotic grist. Of course, the men are tossed into the script for deviance and manipulation, etc. So, however, I did find some films, and my thought, where hot bi babes were not there for all straight men, and they actually didn't revert to straight. And I found these two rom-coms, romantic comedies, April Shower and Imagine Me and You, which for some of the young bisexual women I worked with thought were really cool. Because in these films, marriages, those heteronormative structures are really boring and unimportant. And in fact, one of the characters leaves her straight marriage as she's getting married to go and live with her maid of honour, who she suddenly realised, hang on, I really love you. Why am I marrying him? Okay, that's it, over and done with, that's it. And so she actually was really, really quite transgressive. And also that it actually overcomes that homonormative construction that women will leave women for men. And finally, the inevitability, and I said that, yeah. And that also someone identifying as lesbian or straight, that is necessarily fixed. So these films, even though the genre is really light, but for some of the people who are watching these films, these were insights into possibilities. And again, it's about who's determining which film people should watch. This was really, really interesting. All right, male bisexuality in film. Here we go. Seductive, deceptive, destructive to heteronormative families. However, this is the other side that I think we really need to think about and work with. They constantly expose the fragility, the ignorance, and the violence within heteronormativity. So those two sides are fascinating. I'm thinking of Dallas Dole. I'm thinking of Pierre Pasolini's Teorema, a Michael York film, Something for Everyone. These guys are bisexual guys. They move in to a lovely nuclear family. They begin to have sex with each member of the family who try really hard to, I can't, and they do. And then these men kind of move out of the family, and they've left that heteronormative totally fragmented. And in Pasolini's film, they actually have to say, I took a risk with you and now I have learnt so much more. Like, it's really fascinating. So problematic, and yet there's some interesting, if you invert the gaze, some interesting things being said about heteronormativity. And the Rocky Horror Picture Show, of course, you know, Dr. Frankenfurter, the sweet transvestite from the planet of transsexual. And there goes good old Brad and Janet, lost in the middle of the stormy night. I love all the metaphors and symbols. And of course, soon, and then leave, realising they cannot be who they were. And they have learnt much more to go back to that middle America. Unfortunately, of course, Frankenfurter has to die. But, but there's some really interesting themes coming through there. Bisexual men as AIDS vectors. I'm thinking of Cyril Collard's autobiography, which was made into a film called Savage Nights, where he has unsafe sex with male and female partners. The female partner is represented as wanting unsafe sex. She wants the HIV because that's her demonstration of her love. Now, again, I'm not necessarily saying demonise, but what I'm saying is if that's the only representation we get of bisexual men who are HIV positive, it's problematic. When there are many bi men who may be HIV positive and have very different views. However, from Dominant Construct, we actually found this film, The 24th Day, which was actually quite disruptive. What I loved about this film, and I won't give you the spoiler for this, but what I loved about this film is that the bisexual character imprisons the gay character for a day, takes his blood, goes off to get it tested, assuming that the gay man has passed on HIV to him and his wife. And when you unravel the plot and you go through this film, in 24 hours, there's some really disruptive stuff there. I'll leave it at that. It's really interesting, and it's like, yes, and the ambiguities are really fantastic. Films that represent bi misogyny and bi patriarchy. Again, I love so much of Francois Ozon's work, really incredible work, but this film set up a young bisexual man who's beautiful, innocent, sweet, good, against the older bisexual man who's evil, manipulative, destroys people. And I found that, again, let's position two bi men against each other, the slices of the pie, which was fantastic, which was very sad. And so you've got this patriarchal, predatory, and then you've got everybody trying to change, like Vera has a sex change for him, and Anna, who wants to marry the younger bi man, knowing he's bi, suddenly gets, decides her life can't go that way. I'll leave it at that, but again, it's a film that is upheld, but it's quite problematic as well for some of the bi men I worked with. And Pierce Brosnan, strutting his stuff in The Matador, set in Spain. He plays a hard-drinking, charismatic, hypersexual, bisexual man who's a criminal and he's an underage spy. What was fascinating about this film is that Pierce Brosnan has actually played James Bond, the hypersexual, heterosexual, rah-rah-rah. But what he does here is that because he's bisexual, he's clumsy, he makes mistakes, so he's kind of parodying. Is he parodying heterosexual masculinity, hegemonic masculinity, or is he actually disturbing and trivialising bisexual masculinities, or both? I thought, so again, it's another film I'd really watch. And of course, again, he almost disrupts a heteromonogamous family. Interesting. Dog Day Afternoon, Al Pacino, who plays this Italian-American bisexual thief, of course. He's going in to steal from a bank. It was based on a true story, but they made the character Italian-American rather than Polish-American. Of course, that's what you can do. Just change someone's whole culture for the sake of a movie, because apparently Italians might be better with guns, mafia, all that stuff. Sorry, Tatiana. Those stereotypes really bother me on a whole range of other levels. In this film, he robs a bank because he's trying to pay money for his male-to-female partner's trans surgery. What was really interesting here, and this is the documentary that has actually been made about the real guy. Don't you love the imagery? The Hollywood image of the bisexual man, and the real guy, John Wojtowicz, holding the gun. Very, very different imagery. What was really interesting is that the real John Voitovich, he actually wrote a letter to the New York Times from prison and said he was disgusted about the representations of himself in the film, and also disgusted with the way both his cisgender wife and his trans wife were represented, and how appalling it was to have the women in his life represented in that way. So really, and this doco's just come out. I haven't seen it yet, but again, some of my research participants have been saying, you've got to see this is coming out, because this is actually going to really disrupt this original representation. Unfortunately, John's letter was published in the New York Times, and then it was kind of let go, because of course the money, the privilege, the power behind Al Pacino, Hollywood, the film, overruled the fact that this was about the real person sitting in prison watching the film about himself, going, huh? Where did that come in? And the representation of his cisgender wife was appalling. You know, the very misogynist in representation. So that would be something I'd be interesting to follow up. Okay, bisexual men are unable to commit, whatever that means, to either monogamy or polyamory. Sunday Bloody Sunday, again, 1971, from that interesting era of exploration. But you've got a bisexual man here who leaves both his partners in the UK to go to America to live a free life in the States. And he leaves both of these people to console each other, the gay man and the straight woman. So again, you've got that person in the middle, this ambiguous, problematic border person who disrupts the polarities and upsets and creates pain for both polarities. And you can't trust, because they might just one day decide to up and go. But the fact is that the bisexual character in this film has been trying to negotiate, trying to navigate much more open relationships with both those characters. But that kind of gets underwritten in the film. Gay men should never love bisexual men. Another predominant theme. Lots of gay partners in these films express anger, betrayal, jealousy. And here's a range of films. The Dying Gaul, Leaving Metropolis, where the constant emotional trauma that a gay man will experience because of being in love with a bisexual man. This Peruvian film, Undertow, I'm not sure if I'm saying it correct, Contra Corriente? Yeah? It was a really very interesting film, because again, it's what Pepper talked about. These are people who live in a small, rural, a little small fishing village, poverty. It's important for the community to stick together. He's a married man in love with a gay partner who drowns, and this interesting symbolism occurs where he goes and finds the body, but he doesn't want to take the body out of the water, because then his bisexuality will be revealed. He's got to put his partner through a ritual, a funeral that the whole village does. And what he does, though, and whether it's imaginary or whether the ghost is really there, is his partner moves in with him and his wife and lives with them. And he can actually walk down the public streets of the village with his partner, because no one else sees his partner. And he can watch TV, and they can all hang out. It's a very, very moving, a very, very sensitive film. And may I say, shamefully, Australia, the US and the UK are not producing such sensitive films and realistic films as are coming across from European and South American places. This is one I would recommend. Again, the multiplicity, the ambiguity, the socioeconomic class factors. I won't tell you the ending for this one. I just think it's a film which really plays with metaphor and symbol. It's very, very, very interestingly done. And the pain that is experienced by all of them because of this social construct, rather than one person being demonised. Real bisexual married men appear in film. Dee Lovely was the first biopic of Cole Porter, who actually is the first mainstream film in which a bisexual man actually tells his wife that he's bi before that. And of course the Kinsey film, most people would be familiar with that. Alfred Kinsey, bi-experimentation, poly-experimentation. I found the ending problematic. But, Alfred Kinsey and his wife are seen walking through nature, tall trees, I think it's the redwood gums, together towards, as older people. They've reconciled as a monogamous couple. And again, this use of nature as if this is what we're meant to be. We've done all this in our lives. But now we go back to the natural essentialist selves. And I just thought, why? Why spoil this film that tried so hard? And again, I hate to call this, and I'm sorry if I'm being, anti-American, but these Hollywood endings, really bother me. Let's tie it all up nice and neatly, because that's life. We can do that, And I'm like, oh. So, again, I'm sorry if I'm problematising much-loved films for you, which I'm probably going to do now. Okay, Brokeback Mountain. Are they the gay cowboys? Are they bisexual men? Where are their wives in these stories? Women, again, the erasure. And some interesting analysis have been done. What if these guys were not white? Would they have been called on the down low? Why is there so much sympathy? Was so much sympathy there for these characters? Fair enough. But what if these characters had been African American? What if these characters had not been of the privileged group? Would they have been demonised? Would they have been trivialised? Would they have been seen as really evil, as I'll show you in a couple of other films? So this film, as a mainstream film, attracted so much attention. For heteronormatives, it's like, oh, I feel sympathy for gay men now, etc. For a lot of people living, and Heath Ledger, was part of this film and talked at length about it in Australia, what it was like being a straight man, having to kiss and make out, really, again, as some of us said, well, when you look at the number of queer people who have to act straight in film, we don't get that analysis, do we? Like, oh, what was it like to have to kiss a woman? Or what was it like for you to have to kiss a guy? No, but let's have an analysis of straight men playing gay characters and what it was like. Fascinating stuff. But for me, it was the issue of, was it meant for a heteronormative audience? Was it meant to evoke anti-homophobic sympathies? But what was not addressed? And what if these characters weren't who they were? And for me, for many of the women in my research, the offensiveness that these women were kind of written out or were problematic or stopping the guys from being gay. Like there's a whole stuff that wasn't addressed. Torchwood. Has anyone watched Torchwood? It's a great series from the UK where Captain Jack Harkness he first appears in Doctor Who. I love Doctor Who. However, and he suggests, and Doctor Who actually says, well, Jack's orientation, which is pansexual, omnisexual, whatever sexual, that's what you do in the 50th century. And again, that's great, but, I'm not going to be able to be alive in the 50th century. I'd love to see films where it's okay to be pansexual right now, So the science fiction genre is wonderful because apparently humanity can deal with multiple alien species, so therefore humanity will be able to deal with bisexuality. Again, I love this series, and yet I had such problems with this series. Don't you hate it when you go to a movie and go, I really want to love this movie, and I'm deconstructing it at the same time? And he uses those labels. His sexuality is matter of fact, and this was so significant for young bisexual people I worked with. They saw this as, wow, here's a bi guy, and it's in a sci-fi genre, and I'm loving it. And he refers to the sexual classifications of the 20th and 21st centuries, so old school, so really very quaint, he calls them. However, there were problems with this, and that is that his male partner, Ianto, is the one that has to die. He has been married in a previous century, and he's married to a woman who comes back later, and he still proclaims his undying love for her. Not in a way that he treats his male partner. So there's still interesting inequities there. This I loved. I have to say that, yeah, Meg John? The History Boys. Alan Bennett's play. Again, let's problematise white privilege. Definitely, as I said, all those things go with this film. But what was really interesting for my research participants is that Dakin is the only person in the film as a bisexual young man who's comfortable and confident with his bisexuality. And he really highlights the polarities. He's used as a conduit to look at the problems of the ageing teacher Hector, who's a married homosexual or bisexual guy, you never know, who compensates for loneliness and sexual repression by taking boys home on his motor scooter and touching them up. Interestingly, the guys don't have a problem with that. It's poor little old Hector, He's a lonely teacher. Just let him have a feel. What's the deal? Which really problematises this kind of censorship, sexual abuse stuff, which I'll be talking about next weekend in Sydney at one of the conferences. And Irwin, who's a closeted young gay teacher, who Dakin kind of flirts with, proposes propositions, and actually gets him to out himself. So you've got this bi character. Yes, he's in the middle, but he actually shows up the insecurities of others. And he actually, that's him there, he actually goes beyond oppression and ignorance. So yeah, he's manipulative, he's seductive, he's charismatic, but he becomes a catalyst in the film. He scrutinises the Jewish young guy, for example, who can't come out, but talks about his marginality. When the headmaster wants to expel Hector, because he's found out that Hector has been touching up boys on his motor scooter, Dakin, who's been having sex with the headmaster's secretary, actually goes into the headmaster's office and says, if you're going to expel him, I'm going to let everyone know about what you're doing with your secretary. So he actually he just destroys, sorry I've given you spoilers, but he actually destroys, he just really looks through, sees through and destroys some of those kinds of illusions and hypocrisies. Oh, bisexual fathers, I'm coming home now. Priscilla, Queen of the Desert. I love the outback, I love the desert, trekking through the desert, and the bisexual father image. Tick is a bisexual, he has a wife and a son in Alice Springs. It's based on a well-known Sydney drag queen called Cindy Pastel, and in real life, the partner and the son moved with him to Sydney and lived with them. There's a few problems with this film though, major problems. Firstly, it was interesting that the real person, rather than life imitating art, Richie Fingers, who plays Cindy Pastel, actually opted out of the gay community in Sydney because this film revealed his bisexuality in a way that made his life problematic in the queer, so-called Sydney gay and lesbian Mardi Gras community, and made his life very difficult. And he actually wrote in 2008, I've got to pull away from the scene because I just don't feel like I fit in. So he went from being a really powerful drag queen, prominent, doing his stuff. The film outed him as bisexual, the demise of his position in the community. Other issues about this film, the racism is appalling, absolutely appalling. The representation of the Asian woman in this film is disgusting. And in Australia, we have got this horrible stereotype of, the Filipino bride and rah, rah, rah. The misogyny and the homophobia towards the woman in the bar is really problematic. So again, one of those films is like, yeah, funny, ha-ha, but there was some incredibly difficult racist and misogynist issues with this film as well. Again, death at a funeral. Some people would know Game of Thrones. Peter Dinklage was in this film, playing the gay lover of a very upstanding citizen from the UK, death at a funeral, and whose bisexuality is revealed when the gay lover turns up because he wants some of the money that's owed to him in the will. And it's a bit of a dark comedy. It's really hilarious. And yet what's interesting about this film is the eulogy at the end that one of the sons gives is actually really powerful about how important their dad was and how he wishes his dad had been able to live out all these realities while he was alive, etc. Very interesting. And then Polyamorous Fathers. Again, you only find out that they're bi or poly after they're dead. And this was Eulogy, another dark comedy. Isn't death such a useful trope in all these films? And so they all turn up to the screening of his will. Everybody wants a part of their father's. And then they find out he's actually got 3 families. And so they now have to go and tell the other 2 families that, the father has died, the patriarch has died, and what's that going to mean for the finances, for love, for relationships. So interesting developments there. We have seen some changes from tragedy to happy endings. To the extreme, I found very problematic that apparently a bi father who's part of the BDSM, gay, queer communities can't be a good father. And of course, he has to die. Even though, I hate this, even though the boy who wants to, he's got a female partner who has an accident, who dies, and the boy actually wants to be with him. The young man runs away from state care because he wants to be with his mum's partner. And the whole film is about how this guy is traumatised. Can I be a father if I'm bisexual? Can I be a father if I also love dancing and hanging out at parties and having, really, you know, and having, I wish straight people would ask themselves some of those questions, you know. But then we got to these films. Again, excuse me if I'm saying this wrong. Azul oscuro, casi negro, almost blue, black, almost blue. Yeah. Fantastic film where a side story is where the again sons, interesting, the father-son thing around masculinities. The son realises his father's been going to a masseur and getting a happy ending at the end of the masseur. First he's really worried about it. He thinks, oh, I can actually blackmail my dad, then he can buy me a van, rah, rah, rah. Then he realises his mother knows all the time and says, what are you doing? You're so stupid, relax about this. Then he decides he needs to go and find out who this masseur is. And then he realises he really loves the happy endings as well. You know, like, it's just so much more refreshing than, and really interesting film. Big Love. I know, I think Jessica, you did, Jessica? Yeah, really great article on this. Again, yeah, white, very problematic. It's the patriarch, and I loved your words about it's a heteronormative family, tripleized or whatever the word is. But it did have some insights for the women I worked with and the poly families I worked with in terms of how do these families handle external stigmatisation? What are the children's mixed responses to having poly parents? How do you work that out? How does that get sorted at school with their partners? And also the internal differences. You know, it kind of does set up rural fundamentalism against urban, affluent, you know, white middle-class American Mormons. So that was one representation that we got in Australia. The poly potential is a plot, you know, you're almost there, you're hanging on, you're thinking they're going to work it out. You even get lines in the films like, there's got to be a way of working things out. And then one of them dies. These are big blockbuster Hollywood films, 2012 and Pearl Harbor. You know, at the end, you know, who's going to be with who, but it all gets beautifully resolved when someone dies in the war and someone dies in the flood. So it's like it's just so easy. And I had my research participants goes, you're hanging on, you're thinking this is disgusting, you know, when can we change this? Also, this was a lovely film from France, Marie-Jo and her two partners. I won't even try to say the French, Des Amours. And again, it's so realistic because it shows you the compromises, the pain, the pleasure of trying to work out a poly relationship. But in the end, her husband takes her on a boat. He gets hit on the head. He drowns. She tries to go in to save him. And of course, they both drowned and they're both washed up on the shore, entangled with each other. I don't know what's happened to the other partner. Somehow the other partner just suddenly disappears from the film. And it's like, you see, in death they are reunited in the way they're meant to be, which is really, really problematic. And I'm going to move on. Poly people are humorous, they're criminals, ordinary decent people. How much longer have I got, Daniel? 5 minutes, done, easy. Okay, so the thief is, you know, he marries the two sisters are madly in love with him, they raise their kids. It's a very Irish Catholic representation. They have a Holy Communion party. And of course, to escape the law, he has to fake his death, and the whole poly family holds this beautiful fake Irish Catholic funeral. Yeah, quite a bit of fun. Kevin Spacey, of course, plays a great role. Bandits with Cate Blanchett. Yeah, it's this one was one that people talk. Bruce Willis, Billy Bob Thornton. She says, the two of you make my perfect man. Again, very white. They're criminals, they're thieves. They actually steal her from a heteronormative, heteropatriarchal family, and then she's really glad and she turns the stealing into, you rescued me. So some interesting, and again they escape by faking their deaths. At least the deaths are fake and they live on. December Bride, I'm going to hurry this. December Bride was a very beautiful film, again set in in poverty in the turn of the century Ireland. A very beautiful film where she marries two brothers. She refuses to go through a wedding ceremony. However, her daughter grows up, wants to get married. She can't get married because the local priest says you can't get married unless your mum's married. So she has to stage a wedding, but what she does, instead of having a maid of honour, she puts her second partner next to her, so she's actually getting married with both men. around her. Very interesting film set in destitution, poverty, and a very resilient film. Okay. Splendour, another film by Greg Araki, this kind of girl fag, and again the issue of pregnancy, fathering, etc. I'm sorry if I'm going to move it on a little bit quicker. I'd recommend watching this. She actually expresses her desire. Again, they're pretty, they're good looking, they're white. French twist, yeah, 1995. Josiane Balasco's film, which really, again, so much more nuanced and ambiguous and multiple than the US, UK and Australian, shamefully, which Australian film has come out. And again, this idea of the twist from moving from heteropatriarchal monogamy into a mess desire reality of bisexuality and polyamory. Now, yesterday I spoke with Brazilian people in this conference around me, you, them. And it was so good to get those insights. Me, you, them, set in absolute destitution, in poverty, basically surviving. One woman with 3 men. First she's coerced into marriage with one, then she coerces the other men into her relationships. They have their children and they're just trying to survive. And I loved the fact that this, again, stepped out of this kind of urban, affluent, white, middle-class setting. And again, it's interesting that this is from Brazil, where these films are coming from, trying to work with those multiple marginalities that I think were very important. We're seeing new directions, from hetero-exceptionalism to hetero-flexibility. Guys who go, oh, I used to have sex with you when I was in high school, but that was a teenage thing, being pushed to try again, and just the anxieties. I think, Ryan, like your work works on that. And now we're moving into a beautiful recent film, 13 minutes or so, where 2 guys who identify as straight but are really open and want to talk about their sexual intimacy with each other in very nuanced ways. So there's been, I'm sorry I can't go more into those films, but just some of these shifts are really interesting. And new directions, however, my problem is, as Pepper said, and Brigitte and so many people here are saying, yeah, we're moving forward to hopefully more positive representations, but we're not getting the ethnic, racial, socioeconomic class diversity, religious diversity. This is the first poly film that's been made in India, 3 on a bed. It's making me annoyed because where can we get this film? Why can't we see this film? You know, we need to have, we've got so many film festivals in Australia because we are migrant refugee communities, although some Australians would prefer not to think about that, and we colonise the Indigenous people. We have so many film festivals. Why didn't the Indian Film Festival in Australia show this film? You know, so the erasures within these films. The Witnesses has a Muslim, I don't know what the French name of this film is. He's Muslim. He's in an open relationship with a white French woman. He's an officer, police officer, and he falls in love with a younger man. And the permutations are so much more nuanced. And the down low, African American men. They're not the brokeback men, apparently. They're and these films about religion and suffering, and that these guys can be quite manipulative, is very problematic. Okay, last slide, I think. These 3 films, and Natasha, you're here and gave a beautiful paper, which I only got the end of yesterday. But again, we're starting to see poly potentials becoming poly realities in film, and they're coming from predominantly European countries who are really trying to work with those nuances. 3, I love the way it ends in a Petri dish. The 3 of them, it's like, yeah, it's all an experiment. And that pulling away of the camera. So it's just so beautiful. Tom Tykwer's film. A Spanish film, Angels of Sex, where these young people work it out. No one dies. And they work it out, which is, again, this generation. I know, they're pretty, they're gorgeous, and the other one, so these films, and that you can have babies in poly families, and it's going to be fine. It's really interesting. And I really love Farzan. Yeah, this is it. I'm finished. Sorry, Daniel. I can't help it. I love all this stuff. Farzan Ozbatek's films. He's a Turkish filmmaker living in Italy, who's made Hamam and His Secret Life, which is a ridiculous English translation of Il fate ignoranti, and the meanings of this film gets reduced to this. But in this film, unfortunately, my problem is that both the bisexual men have to die before their partners go into queer, poly, multicultural, multi-faith communities, and establish queer kinships. So heteronormativity, binormativity, mononormativity has to go before you can actually move in. But I think this is the beginning of some really beautiful films and these films are all going to come in. The last thing, I know this is familiar to most of you. I love Alan's work in Poly in the Media. So if you want to go into a site that takes you into what's coming up around the world, this is fantastic. Wayne Bryant, Vito Russo, who's passed away, of course. I used his work a lot. Maria Sanfilippo and John Vicardi have also done some wonderful work on analysis. I want to leave it there. I'm sorry I'm over time, but I just thought a little bit of a romp through the films. Thank you.